Hi everyone and welcome to the Deakin Alumni Webinar with Ingrid Leeton. My name is Farisha Rahman from the Central Alumni Relations team. Today we're broadcasting from the Burwood campus and our webinar topic today is Taking a People Approach to Change. Ingrid is the Manager of Change and Capability for Strategic Human Resources Projects at Deakin University. She is an accredited change specialist and an organisational development consultant. Over the past decade, she has worked across a variety of industries, including higher education, health, and the public sector, to design and implement practical solutions for cultural and behavioural change programs. She focuses on developing a sustainable approach to change through people, including leadership development, meaningful engagement processes, and resiliency to support teams through change. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ingrid. I'm going to pass over to you now to begin our webinar presentation.
Thank you, Farisha, and thank you everyone for joining us today to explore this topic. So in today's webinar, I've taken the approach to explore elements of change based on my experience as a change practitioner and also from my perspective as an employee and a participant of change. So the structure of the webinar starts with an outline on some of the key models of change that have influenced the management of change programs. And so I'm hoping that this will also give some context leading into a discussion on people and change, particularly as I'll explore how research on our brains can help us better understand how people react in times of change. Next, I'd like to share some of the tactics I've used that I found helpful when leading change programs. And we're doing something a bit different today that I'd like to ask some questions as we progress through the webinar, as I would like to make this an interactive session. But if we don't get to all of the responses, we can certainly cover that off at the end where we've got time for the additional questions. Great. So in terms of on the screen, you'll see that under evolution of change, I've listed 3 different change models. So there's many more that we could explore, such as the William Bridges transition model. But given our limited time today, I've kept the focus on 3 models only. And I've decided to start with these models because I think it's important to reflect on how change management is an evolving discipline that itself has changed significantly over the last few decades. In the past, we've approached change in a more linear and sequential way. Although the key principles of leading change have remained relatively the same, the practices of change management have to evolve to meet the ever-changing needs of people in today's organisations. Trends such as globalisation, a multi-generational workforce, increased mobility, digital transformation and artificial intelligence are forcing us to set aside the traditional linear approaches in favour of more refreshed feedback-driven approaches to create and implement successful organisational change. I also think it's important to point out that managing change in organisations is hard work. It can be very rewarding, and I personally like the challenges that come my way, but it is certainly not an easy remit. And I know I'm not alone in thinking this because research consistently shows us that high numbers of change initiatives fail. A figure of 70% failure rate is commonly used, and it was in an article provided by Beer and Nahiri in their Harvard Business Review article called Cracking the Change Code. This figure in the article also aligns with other academic reviews, which have estimated failure rates for change implementation as ranging somewhere between 28% to as high as 93%. And another point I'd like to make centres on the frequency of change that we encounter day to day. Leaders in their organisations in where we work are looking for ways to manage efficient and sustainable growth in a VUCA world, meaning environments that prompt high levels of volatility, uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity. So organisations must continually adapt to meet our ever-changing market needs and to stay ahead of competitors. And a recent insight survey conducted by Forbes found that global executives believed their organisations needed to change ahead of their industry in order to stay relevant, and that 86% of the respondents said their organisation should be executing a business transformation initiative regularly to stay competitive and relevant. So the first model that I want to talk about is called the 3-stage model, and many of you may be familiar with this model, But for those of you who aren't, this is an organisational change model that was first put together by Kurt Lewin in 1947. And it's been a model that's of academic interest for well over half a century now. And at the time, it was very pioneering research in this area. And a lot of the change models that progressed after this really based on this particular model. So it's very simple and practical framework from a visual perspective. So you can see the graphic that I've got there representing the 3 stages. The first stage is unfreezing. And an analogy to think about this is before you cook a meal that's been frozen, you need to make sure you defrost or thaw it out. So the same can be said to applying that to change. Before a change can be implemented, it needs to go through an initial step of unfreezing. Because many people will naturally resist change, the goal during the unfreezing stage is to create an awareness of how the status quo or the current level of acceptability is hindering or there's a problem that needs to be solved in some way. So this means that old behaviours, which could be ways of thinking, processes, people and organisational structures, all need to be carefully examined to show employees how necessary a change is for organisation to create or maintain a competitive advantage in the marketplace. Communication is especially important during the unfreezing stage so that employees can become informed about the imminent change, the logic behind it, and how it will benefit each employee. So the idea is that the more we know about a change and the more we feel it is necessary and urgent, the more motivated we are to accept the change. So the next stage in Lewin's model is changing. So now that the people are unfrozen, if you like, they can begin to move. So Lewin recognised that change is a process where the organisation must transition or move into this new state of being. This changing step, also referred to as transitioning or moving, is marked by the implementation of the change. This is when change becomes real. It's also consequently the time that most people struggle with a new reality. It is a time marked with uncertainty and fear, and it's making the hardest step to overcome. During the change step, people begin to learn the new behaviours, processes and ways of thinking. The more prepared they are for this step, the easier it is to complete. And this is the reason that we've got education, communication, support, and allowing time for employees as they become familiar with the change. Again, change is a process that needs to be carefully planned and executed. And throughout this process, employees should be reminded of the reasons for the change and how it would benefit them once fully implemented. So the third stage of the model is around refreezing. So Lewin called the final stage to refer to that to symbolise the act of reinforcing, stabilising and solidifying the new state after the change. The changes made to the organisational processes, goals, structure, offerings or people are accepted and then refrozen as the new normal status quo. Lewin found the refreezing step to be especially important to ensure that people do not revert back to the old ways of thinking or doing prior to the implementation of the change. So efforts must be made to guarantee the change is not lost, and it needs to be cemented into the organisation's culture and maintained as the acceptable way of thinking or doing. So the ways that you can reinforce that is through positive rewards and acknowledgement of people's efforts, and they're often used as a way to reinforce that new state because it's believed that positively reinforcing behaviour will likely be repeated. And I've personally found that model helpful when I'm thinking about planning, say, change at the very beginning of the process, when I'm thinking about how I can chunk down particular aspects of the project plan. And the second model that I wanted to talk about today is one that we certainly almost as popular as the Lewin model, is around John Kotter's 8-step model. So it's also quite practical, and it sees change as a stepped process in which there are a series of 8 phases. So the first one is around creating a sense of urgency. So for the change to happen, the whole organisation really needs to want it. It's about developing a sense of urgency around why we're having the change and what problem it's solving, again, the value that it's going to create for the organisation. And it isn't simply a matter of doing a presentation and showing people a whole lot of statistics. It's really about having open and honest conversations about what's happening in the marketplace, what's happening with competition if that's relevant. But it's about getting people to talk about the change that you're proposing and developing that sense of urgency that can feed on and build momentum. So John Cotter suggests that the ways that you can do that is by getting people involved in identifying potential threats, getting them to help develop some scenarios about what could happen in the future, and also having people understand what other opportunities that could potentially be exploited in the future, and really having the dynamic and convincing reasons and developing those to get people talking and thinking. So the second element, or the second step, is around forming a powerful coalition. So one of the things that Cotter recommends is it's convincing people that change is necessary. So it's about taking strong leadership and very visible support from key people within the organisation. And it's about, when he's referring to a coalition, he's talking about bringing together a team of influential people whose power comes from a variety of sources. It's not just hierarchical, but it's also thinking about their expertise, their political importance in the hierarchy. And it's about working together as a team to continuing to build urgency and momentum around the need for change. So it's also making sure that you're really getting that emotional commitment from these people. And that it is also having an analysis about the group of people themselves and the mix in terms of if there's that spread across the organisation, spread across the different levels and the various expertise and backgrounds that people can bring. So the third step that Cotter talks about is around creating a vision for change. So it's when you first start thinking about change, there will probably be many great ideas and solutions coming around. So the idea is to link these concepts to an overall vision that people can grasp easily and remember. And so the idea is that when people see and read the vision and hear about it, they can actually picture themselves contributing to that and being part of what you're trying to achieve. So some of the suggestions that Cotter has put forward is around understanding what are the values that underpin, that sit behind the change that you can connect people to. Strategies such as developing a really short summary that explains the change, that really makes it easy for people to be able to recognise, and it also makes it easier for the communications to cascade down into the organisation. So following on from that is around communicating the vision. And so that's actually about, having that strong message that from day to day communications are embedded. So whether that's in the leadership development programs, in the induction programs that you have with staff, but it really becomes part of that DNA. And it also parts of the agendas in regular team meetings if it's an organisational change project. So the next step is around removing obstacles. So if you're having a look on the screen, you can see that it's also enabling action by removing barriers. So these obstacles or these barriers are about identifying what's getting in the way. So at this stage, if you've been talking about your vision and you've been getting buy-in from people, hopefully it's also generating conversations around what's potential processes or structures that are getting in the way, and it's creating the space for people to feel that they can raise those issues and have the opportunity to be able to work with that coalition to identify, so what are the ways that we can mitigate those barriers and remove them. So some of the tactics that John Cotter has specifically listed around that is around having specialist change people involved in the program, but also having a look at, from an organisational structure perspective, what are the ways that you can embed the change into the program. So whether that's something that, if it's a whole of organisation change, whether that's thinking about the position descriptions, whether that's the conversations that you're having when you're interviewing potential candidates for roles, And it's also in terms of what are the general ways that people are applying and thinking about the change in their day-to-day and what they're doing. So the next step after that is around creating short-term wins. And I particularly find this helpful when I'm designing my programs and doing the change management planning, to think about what are some of the, Cotter calls them quick wins, but what are some of the things that you can do early on in the piece that can actually signify that change is progressing, and that we're moving from that talking phase, thinking about what the future looks like, to actually getting stuff done. And so Cotter talks about, the fact that delivering some of those things successfully early on can build the momentum and that motivation for people to support the change ongoing. And so you need to, in the planning, make sure that those smaller targets are very achievable, because it would be, a critical error if you had any failures early on, because it wouldn't set the scene very well for the rest of the program. But it's really about coming up with these targets that are very successful, that are achievable, but that are meaningful, and so that people can see that they do signify something that would be of value for the organisation. So the next step after that is around sustaining acceleration or building on the change. So once you've had those early wins, it's really about making sure that you have that continuous opportunity to build on what went right, and also use that as an opportunity to review what you could improve. So having those post-implementation reviews built into the change program as you're rolling that out, after each of those milestones or each of those short quick wins, is a really important step to make sure that you can identify, so what are some of those repeatable success factors, and if there were things that could be improved. It's really about taking a very practical approach, and it's just, trying to work through what were the elements that could be enhanced or improved, in order to make sure that you're really focused on successful implementation for the future. And so the next step is really about making sure that you're anchoring the change. So really making sure that it's sticking, it's very sustainable. So it's that continuous efforts to make sure that it has been embedded, and it's something that, as the change management has evolved, it's really that shifting from actually the day after the program's been launched or the week after, to really moving to a phase that's embedded in programs that's really about how to make sure that that change is sustained over the time. So in terms of just a summary around Cotter's model, I've personally applied many of these suggestions in my projects, but the challenge that I have with all of these change models, and I'm sure I'm not alone, is that there's often numerous change programs happening simultaneously across the organisation that I work in, and I often work in very large organisations. So I spend a lot of my time working with other change managers or other program managers, trying to identify, when we're coming up with things like our strategic vision for a program, how does it actually fit into the broader strategic vision that the organisation is trying to achieve, and what are the ways that we can actually work together to align some of our touch points. And I'm also really conscious that sometimes when we're identifying that coalition team, often there's key people in the organisation that everybody would like to have a little bit of their time. So how do I actually make sure that it's sustainable for those individuals? So who else could potentially be involved? And then, because I do have that organisational development background, I also think from the perspective of talent and succession. So who else might be able to be involved in this project that could have some mentoring or support from some of those people in the ideal coalition, but that have that opportunity as well to be involved and to be advocates, because in the future, obviously that I would be trying to target people that already have high levels of credibility, but who else? So it also fits that broader aim about giving people stretch opportunities and things like that. So then the final model out of the three that I've chosen to talk about today is around the SCARF model. And many of you may have heard about this as well. So it's something that was developed by David Rock, who is an Australian researcher, in 2008. And it's described as a brain-based model. And why I really like it is because it leverages some neuroscience research around how our brain works, particularly within the field of social, cognitive, and affective neuroscience. And it gives us some insights that we can apply to a change perspective. And so David Rock's model suggests that there are 5 categories of events that can activate positive and negative emotions in our interactions with others. And so by knowing these 5 categories, we can both understand emotions and we can modify our behaviour to proactively influence emotions and their effect on decisions, behaviour and performance. So the first one is around status, and that's looking at our relative importance to others. So in a nutshell, the status domains mean that we are constantly evaluating our own importance relative to others. So keep in mind that this isn't just a positional hierarchy that may give someone status. It can also be informational knowledge. So someone who's in the know may be perceived as having more status than someone who's not. So the delicate balancing act for us when we're working with leaders in organisations is to make sure that we're on the lookout for opportunities to elevate the status of team members, so either real or perceived, and it's without making other team members feel like they're being left behind. So from a change perspective, it presents opportunities to be more open with information about what's going on, but also be very considerate about and considering when we're rolling out communications and key pieces of information, the impact of that sequencing and the timing of those communications and the impact that that can have on people. So from a status point of view, the pain of being left out can be real, but the pleasure of being included is real also in terms of from a neural chemistry perspective. So the next element is certainty. So as you'd expect, the social dimension of certainty is about being able to predict the future, or at least having a sense of assurance about what the future holds. So in some cases, certainty can give us pleasure more often than not, but it's a lack of certainty that can bring us pain. And so this is why change can cause a lot of angst. With many of us, the idea of change fundamentally carries with it some risk and some lack of certainty. So under the domain of status, we mentioned the value of being open to help overcome the barriers of status. And in the domain of certainty, openness is even more critical. One thing we say is that you can't over-communicate during change. When people say we're getting too much communication, then you're probably hitting the mark and delivering the right amount. So as I mentioned before, it's also keeping in mind not only the timing of the communication, but it's the style of the communication. So in an organisation, emails are certainly one way, but as I'm sure that you all appreciate, we get slammed with emails every day. So it's also thinking about what are some, that's a well-written communication path, but you really need to think about, so what are some other ways that you can connect with people on a more personal level? So sometimes you work in organisations and you don't have the luxury of those face-to-face interactions. But, things like videos, being able to have some sort of, if possible, organised for people to have morning teas, etc., I have found in the past is a really good way to stand out from emails and provides that dialogue and that connection for people to build some trust, to be able to have conversations. And of course, as sometimes occurs quite frequently during change, there are periods in the program that you're actually not able to talk about anything or to share the progress because you yourself may not have that information. You might be waiting on for a board to come back with a particular approving or endorsing a particular element of the program, or there might be some other external factors that are complicating things. But it's really important that you're still progressing through the communication, even if you're actually just communicating to people that we don't have anything further at the moment, but as soon as you do, they'll let you know. And it's building that trust that people really will take on the fact that you have proved previously that you share the information as quickly as you can when you can. So the next phase of that is around autonomy. So autonomy is about having a sense of control. So it could be control over events, it could be over the work environment, or even over the choices. So what we would really like to do from a change perspective, and I certainly try and do this, is to give people choice. And it's also recognising that the higher level of autonomy or feeling that people have around autonomy, the more that they'll be positive and respond to change. So from a change perspective, a way that we can increase autonomy is to be able to enable people to provide input and feedback throughout the entire cycle of the change program. So opportunities for people to be involved include things like scenario planning, implementation planning, and communications, even development of some of those key messages. So the other component that we have is relatedness. So relatedness essentially equates to a sense of belonging and safety. So it's about considering whether people are friends or foes, about whether you feel included in groups or not. And then ultimately, it links back to whether you're feeling safe or threatened. So from a change program perspective, it's about thinking about the impact of change, and it's really thinking about the culture that is already existent in the organisation and the various teams and departments, and whether that's currently a culture of trust, friendliness and confidence, and whether people feel safe to be able to share their thoughts, their feelings, their expectations about what's working and what's not working, and whether there's any backlash or fear of retribution if people are giving their perspectives and sharing what they think. So from a change perspective, not only are you looking at what are the potential reactions for people around change, but it's really also analysing the culture in those teams and the organisations as a whole to think about what you can do beforehand to create that safe opportunity for people to give feedback. And if there isn't safe, what are the ways that you can work around that people can give feedback that perhaps is confidential and things like that. So from a fairness perspective, which is the last component of the model, it really boils down to the concept of having a fair exchange between people, having the same set of rules and expectations of each other. So from a change perspective, I always like to think about the impact of managers who withhold information or perhaps sugarcoat information. And so they're really trying to protect their staff from being concerned or having any negative feelings. And so the impact of that means that withdrawing information means that staff really feel concerned about what's not being said and could potentially lead for them feeling unfairness about the whole change process. So what I always try and do is to draft communications or work with managers to really get them comfortable with the type of information that we're presenting. So they've got time to digest what are the changes. They've had the opportunity to contribute to what does that change look like. They know their areas really well. So having their insights and being able to build that together is a way that they can work through. But then it also provides an opportunity to be able to get some of those managers who perhaps aren't as confident or haven't had potentially as much experience being able to share negative news, because sometimes change is negative, and to be able to work through with them so they feel confident and supported along the way as well. And so I've particularly found this model, the SCARF model from David Rock, helpful when considering about how do I best support managers, employees through the change. And I always think of it from a whole of program perspective, from the very start, even when we're in the business case, the planning stage before things get endorsed, through to the very end of the program, so that we're really taking that long-term sustainable approach. that's a lot of me talking, but this is why I wanted to try and have some questions so we could have a bit of interaction. So then the screen that you're currently seeing now has a picture of a bicycle. So I just wanted to share with you a bit of a story that I found quite fascinating, but it really illustrates about how our brains respond to change. And the bike is called a backwards brain bike. And it's an engineer named Dustin, and he actually has a YouTube channel, and he just had done a TED talk, and he goes around to universities around the world talking about this particular scenario. So it's worth having a look at. If you look at Smarter Everyday website, you'll see a link to it, and it's quite a entertaining video where Destin explains it. But in short, he's an engineer, and he has some welder colleagues who decided that they one day would reverse the controls on a bike, and they wanted to see whether he would be able to ride the bike. So when the handlebars were moved in one direction, the wheels move in the opposite direction. So this might seem like a pretty simple adjustment, but it just is a great way to illustrate that the bike riding pathway in our brains are so ingrained and automatic. So if you're someone who's learned to ride a bike as a child, it's one of those things that it's almost second nature to you as an adult. So even if you don't ride a bike for years, you'll be able to get back on the bike and ride with few or if any issues. So in this scenario, it took Destin 8 months to change the pathways in the brain related to riding a bike. And so the reason why it's so hard to do that is because the brain has evolved to create pathways in the brain that respond to and activate habits. So these automatic pathways explain why there can be some resistance to change. So when faced with something new, our brains immediately compare it with things that we are familiar with. So in general, it takes a lot more time and energy to try something new than it does to do something habitual. So I'm really interested, you'll see the questions up there, about from an organisational perspective, what are the sorts of changes that you think would require this level of rewiring?
Comment from Graham. My experience is that culture change in organisations is amongst the hardest, often hard for everyone to see the case for this change. There is no obvious crisis. Any suggestions?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. That sometimes the drivers for that cultural change are not transparent, and it's really about trying to identify what they are and to make them in a reasonable way, because it's not, an old system that's no longer being supported, that people can have that rational understanding. It really is hard work, and it requires I always spend a lot of time trying to link it to what are the strategies in the future and really get a strong sense of what those drivers are from the organisation, because those are the change programs that I often work on, more than system changes. And, the time required,
Thank you. So did anyone have any responses to the discussion questions we can quickly go through now? We've got a question from Charmaine in relation to the previous change model. Mm-hmm. Are the steps sequential, or do you move back and forwards between each step? So I believe this is the 8-step model.
Yeah, so I absolutely believe that you move back and forth through those steps, that they are great as a sequential process to work through when you're thinking about planning, but the actual reality of implementation means that you are working back and through, because your change vision, I always would have places where I'm refreshing that and thinking about, so what are the key messages and how are they changing, dependent on what else is happening in the organisation, because as you know, we do work in a very responsive world, so things can be completely different 6 months on from the environment that you're working in. So absolutely, it's going back and forth.
Thanks, Ingrid. We've got a few more comments. One from Sandy. What is in it for me? Is an important campaign to drive for something like this? So I think that's in relation to the first discussion point.
Yes, absolutely. It is thinking about it from the individual perspective, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail, but absolutely thinking about it but what's in it for me, or that with them, is a key factor. So thank you for bringing that up. Perfect. And we were just starting to get into some of those discussions as well, such as thinking like the what's in it for me factor. But what I'm also curious is to consider around what are the ways that we can get people involved in change. So some of those models that we talked about described the importance of making sure that people are connected and involved throughout the whole program. But so if you want to think about those two questions that I've got there, so either from the perspective as a change manager, so how do you involve people in change? What have you found successful? Or perhaps you're not part of developing change programs or rolling them out, but as an individual, so whether that's someone that's been in an organisation where there has been a new system that's been rolled out, or perhaps you've relocated to a new building, or there might be some other legislation changes, things like that. How would you like to actually participate in that change? So, for example, whilst you're thinking about that, so from a change manager perspective, some of the things that I mentioned previously was around communications, and other things might be around planning. But from an individual participant perspective, perhaps you have worked in an organisation that's rolled out a new software, for example. So it might be having the opportunity to be able to participate in testing or providing feedback.
Sure, we've got one from Graham. Getting people to reflect on change that they have seen in their careers to date can be an eye-opener to others. We've got another one from Sandy. We can run information sessions, interactive lunch and learnings, etc. to get people's attention. We've got a comment from Kerry. As a manager, finding champions throughout the organisation that display the behaviours to adopt processes so that the change becomes normal.
Yeah, they're all fantastic suggestions, and that importance of identifying, particularly if you're doing those cultural change programs. So there are people in the organisation that are already adopting those behaviours, as Kerry mentioned, to be able to identify them and be able to have them as advocates, and to recognise the fact that they're already demonstrating that is also a successful way to get people to recognise their role, but also encourage more people to participate in change.
We've got lots more comments coming through. We've got Graham has said to get people who are scared to see that change is a fulfilling new future.
Yes, that it does not always negative, that there actually are positive consequences of change, and to be able to really get those stories out is a really important change tactic.
We've got a comment. I've seen that change has been done badly in the past when information is kept away from employees. So as an individual, I want to be involved and remain informed.
Yeah, Elisa, I think that is. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I've also been a participant or an employee in an organisation where that was occurring, and it is very frustrating. So I always try and put the other hat on, is to think about what are the ways, and not every employee can be involved, obviously, in a program, but, what are the different touch points that you can open that up? So whether that's through surveys, whether that's through having opportunities for staff to attend a workshop to be able to vent, because that's also really important for people to have that opportunity to share their perspective. But it's also making sure that you're building in different ways for people to share and help create what does the new world look like? What are the new processes? Because, they're all experts in their own right, and it's that critical mass of knowledge, because organisations wouldn't be effective without their people. So it's about making sure that we can tap into those avenues of knowledge to be able to create how we can move forward in the future, and that creates that successful momentum for change.
And we'll just do one last comment from Juan. From my experience, it's better to align leadership first and then go into change agents and go to communications and training.
Absolutely agree that it's about tapping into those leaders earlier on. So it's also about doing that assessment, and I will talk about that a little bit more, but in terms of identifying what support those managers and those leaders need, and to make sure that often from a phased approach, that's one of the first things that you're doing when you're rolling out the program, as you're right, before you would cascade that down to employees. But I've also been in an organisation where prior to my career in HR, was in an operations area, and the CEO, there was an announcement from the government that we were relocating, and the organisation had very little time. And as a manager, I had 24 people reporting through to me, and I found out an hour before the announcement went out to all staff. So sometimes it can be a tough gig being a manager. So I always appreciate that.
Sure. Thanks for everyone for typing in and participating in the discussion. We've got a lot of more comments and questions, but we'll try to get to them during the Q&A time after the webinar presentation today.
Thank you. All right. So what I wanted to do now is just explore from an individual perspective, how actually does change impact people? So the first thing that I usually do is, before considering any change initiative, is really to think about how is that affecting employees, both readily in terms of how they'll accept the change, but then also thinking about what are their emotional reactions going to be, and then how can I support people for a sustainable approach. So we explored a little bit before with that backwards brain bike scenario, but to give a little bit more detail about the impact on our brains, I take the perspective that change is often painful, and that's because of the interplay between working memory and focused attention. So working memory is considered a holding area where new information can be compared to known information that's already stored in the brain. So we've talked about that a little bit before with riding the bike. But so to perform a rational comparison of new to old, the brain engages with the prefrontal cortex, which is the brain center for rational thinking. So it's quite energy intensive and can only hold a limited amount of information at a time. So you need to be conscious that it fatigues easily. But the brain's also wired to recognize environmental errors. So things that are different between an expected outcome and the actual outcome. So when the brain perceives this contradiction, there's intense neural firing takes place in an area of the brain that's connected to the fear center. So this in turn engages the fear circuitry of the brain and can start an anger or fear response that's highly counterproductive to any change process. So a few examples on how this can play out during the change programs is that people can experience discomfort. So because change is often requiring people to do something new, and that often forces them outside of a comfort zone. So everyone experiences discomfort to some degree, and as change managers, we need to consider what is actually happening to them on an individual level. The other thing that can happen is people sometimes feel like they need to give something up. So if a change, when it's initially introduced, people they usually view it in the context of their own current situation. And then that means that they're going through a process where they're considering what are they giving up, not necessarily what they may gain. So in order to balance this as change managers, we need to think about, is there any opportunities, and often in the culture change programs that I'm involved in, that there are ways that we can actually help people grow and fulfill their own objectives. So, for example, in programs that I do, often we have the opportunity to be able to accompany the rollout of the change with professional development. So I'm really looking at what are the new skills or that new knowledge that people can acquire that not only will help the organisation achieve its objective of rolling out that change and creating that culture transformation that is usually in the programs I'm involved in, but it's also those individual people. So what skills and what's the benefits to them? As you talked about it before, that's part of that what's in it for me. But for these things, yes, it might be learning a new system as sometimes the case, but it's also acquiring skills that are contemporary and helping sometimes to achieve their career aspirations. So it's really trying to work out what that is. And it's also considering from an individual perspective that what suits one individual may not suit another. So an example of an organisational change that I was involved in some years ago was around the working hours, so that it was around the negotiations of a new enterprise agreement. And so some of the workforce were worked over a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week roster. So one of the changes that the organisation was trying to put forward was actually changing the way that people were paid for working those outside of ordinary hours. And so on an individual basis, for some people it was very unreasonable, that they liked the fact that they were getting overtime and it suited them financially really well. But for other employees, actually having a day off on a Wednesday and being rostered to work on a Saturday in terms of that 5-day-a-week normal roster worked really great for them, because they could attend cricket training with their children and things like that. So I always make sure that I'm trying to influence that people are thinking about, there are pros and cons in any change, but it's thinking through what are the scenarios and how are, what's the impact of that. So a model that I also use that didn't actually start being a typical change model, but it's something that has now been applied, and sometimes it's referred to as the change curve. So it was established by Kubler-Ross in 1969, and it was described in a book that she wrote on death and dying, and it was around the 5 stages of grief. And so they really were first observed as a way that humans respond to learning about terminal illness. But as I mentioned, they've now been adopted over time to really help us think about generally how people are likely to react to change. And always with all of these models, they won't be the only emotions that people will display through change, but it gives you a bit of a broad continuum about how people might respond. So there's 5 stages, and they relate to denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And what's important to note with these stages is that they're all normal reactions to change. And the other thing is, as similar to those other models, people do move back and forward. So I'll give a brief overview of them. So the first one is around denial. And so from a change perspective, that's where you might hear statements, people saying it can't be happening, I can't believe it. So the example I gave where the organisation announced it was relocating, that absolutely was the sentiment when we were first told. And that often it's associated with being numb and in shock. And we really don't want to believe that it's happening. So from a change perspective, employees might deny that the change is happening, and that they will also go through a stage of trying to prove that the new method or the solution won't work. And at this stage, that's where, if you can, having that really well thought out communication to support people through that process. The second stage is around anger. And so this happens when people start to realise that the change is real and it is going to be implemented. And often at this stage, people are really looking to blame something or someone. So in the example that I gave before, it was easy for people to blame the government, but often, sometimes it's the executive or the top leaders in an organisation, and sometimes it can also be the economy or some of those external factors that are blamed. And so it's from an organisational perspective and from a change perspective, it's about making sure that we're thinking about how can we support people through this. So, people need to be able to vent. They need to be able to share their anger and, dissatisfaction with the decisions that are being made. But how can we do that in a healthy way that supports managers so they're not wearing the brunt of it, but also supports people that it's okay, and then really recognising that anger is one of the normal reactions sometimes in change. And the next stage that Kubler-Ross talked about was bargaining. So that, people really will try and postpone if they possibly can. And that's in order to put off the change or to try and find a way out of the situation. So potentially that might be some employees in a work situation might try and work really hard or put in lots of overtime to really make sure to see themselves as being quite invaluable. The other component in the Kubler-Ross model is around depression. So, and that's obviously when we're realising that bargaining's not working and the reality of the change is setting in. So at this point, we've got to be mindful that the impact on change could be that people are really moving towards a very sad state, that they're feeling quite down and they're depressed. And so from an organisational perspective, this can be quite noticeable because we might be dealing with people that are feeling quite demotivated and uncertain about their future. And in my experience, that there's also an increase in things like absenteeism at this time because people are using sick leave. So again, it's really thinking from a support perspective. If it is a really significant organisational change, well, in any case, always have that support process, but particularly important if it is something that's quite a strong impact on individuals, to make sure that there are really strong support processes in place, like employee assistant programs and other components. So the final component of the Kubler-Ross model is around acceptance. So that's actually as people are starting to realise that the change might not be going away, and potentially they might not still be happy about it, but it's that resigned attitude towards the change in a sense that they need to get on with it. So from a change program, it's about when people get to that acceptance stage, what are the ways that, again, you can support them to transition to the next space, but it's also a good opportunity to have dialogue with people to explore the new possibilities, to get them to highlight the things that they've been working through, what we could consider. So I found that the Kubler-Ross model helps me plan, and particularly around that supporting tools, the information and the services that are going to be available to people during the change. And I've also used the model to help other people identify the stage they're currently in, as well as recognising where colleagues may be on the change curve. So I found that people really appreciate the knowledge that these reactions and feelings are normal, and they're not a sign of weakness or, that they're a negative connotation on the individual. But it's also, the benefit is that people get a bit of a sense of why colleagues are behaving in a particular way. Yeah, so the next area is around networks. And so the image that I've got there from a jigsaw puzzle is the fact that often you can work in a large organisation, or it might be a smaller but quite a complex organisation, and it's about how do you tap into the right people? How can you identify the kinds of people that will be helpful? So in Cotter's language is around a coalition, but sometimes it might be the change project team, it might be a steering committee, there's a whole different ways to describe it, but it's really about who are those people and what's the combination of talents and experience and skills that can really help you with the change program. So there's a number of roles that I have that I always try and think through. So really what's very important to me is around the subject matter experts, because I recognise that I may not be the expert in the change that's we're trying to implement. So it's really important to me to identify who are those technical experts, or who are those people that have really strong knowledge in a particular topic, that are credible and that are seen by other members of the organisation as being subject matter experts. And so the other people that I really try and think about is who are those key influencers across the organisation. So when people want to know something, who do they go to? And so sometimes people call them the top 100. It depends on the size of the organisation. But it's really that there are certain people in organisations who are always the go-to, and I try and find out who they are. Then I also think about who are real people that are well placed to be advocates of the program, to be able to talk about the benefits, that really have the confidence and the credibility to be able to communicate in lots of different forums. And then the other component that I think about is who are people that can connect me into other people, who are people that have really well established networks in areas of the organisation that I don't know. So they might be executive assistants, they might be, the people that have been working in different projects that I've implemented in similar areas. But I really try and tap into those people as much as I can. And then likewise, when it comes to controllers, so people who control access to information or people. So that could be things like room bookings. So in a university like ours, you need to know who with the room bookings. And the other thing is around change agents. So we mentioned that in one of the discussion points, but it's really about having a bit of an idea about who are those people that actually at the local level have a really good understanding about what's going on, but also will be happy to be involved in the change, and they can help plan and execute tasks. They can be our ears on the ground, and they can support the local sponsors of the area. And then so the last thing that I just wanted to talk through is really, we've touched on it throughout today, is the role of managers and how to make sure that we're really thinking through what are the support that's required for managers, but also how can we give them a meaningful role? Because at the end of the day, they have a really strong understanding of their area. They've got a strong understanding of the individuals and their potential reactions. They've got a strong understanding of the processes and the structures. So I'm always trying to tap into those managers to help me develop the shared purpose or their communication statement, to work through scenarios, to work through the possible questions that people might ask. And then also to ask them, what do they need? So I've got a really clear idea about what are some of the requirements that we're going to need as part of the change program. But the other side is also managers are very helpful, I've found, in helping me understand what are the benefits, because they've got a really good idea of the issues that might either prevent or inhibit achievement. So be able to come up with ideas that can prevent that. So ways that I do that is to get them involved in design workshops from the very beginning, and really as much as is sustainable for them and for the program and the organisation, to have them involved from the beginning to the very end of that project. Yeah, so lastly, that's sort of just a summary of what we've covered off today. So it was a very fast-paced and lots of information, but I hope that it was helpful. And certainly, as Farisha mentioned before, a copy of the presentations is being uploaded. So now let's answer some of your questions.
Thank you, Ingrid, for that wonderful presentation. And apologies to our audience, we are going a little bit over time, but for those of you who would like to stick around, we'll answer a few questions. And for those who have to leave, a recording will be available on YouTube in about 2 weeks' time. So our first question from Juan: what do we do with people on leadership positions that can be undermining the change, and how do we approach this?
Yeah, that's a very difficult situation, but it's not an uncommon one. So the approach that I've used in the past is to try and firstly have a conversation with that person and to try and get a bit of understanding about what is their perspective, what perhaps are the elements that's making them resist, and what's driving those reactions. But sometimes people are not transparent, or perhaps they haven't actually processed it themselves, they're just reacting. And there might is to really think through who is someone that can influence that manager. So it might be someone that they report into, it might be someone else that they respect but knows them a little bit better, that in a very respectful and authentic way, but is really trying to find out how we can support that person. But I've also been in other situations where that there has been tough conversations with that individual about that they need to support it, and it's having an impact on them. So it's really navigating that individual circumstance, but it is challenging, definitely.
Thank you. Our next question from Kate: you made a great point earlier that not all change is good. To play the devil's advocate, if a cultural change to values needs to be over-communicated, for example, is met with significant opposition, might this not indicate that the change is bad?
I think it can depend on the situation, but it's a really good point because, sometimes what the decision that an organisation's made, that it might not actually align to your own individual values, and it's about having time to think about, what do you agree with, what you don't agree with, what you resonate. It's very hard to answer in a specific way without a scenario to link that to. But I just really want to acknowledge that that's a really relevant point, that not all change is good. And when it comes to things like values and behaviours and that culture of organisation, it's really being very considered to the circumstances of that.
Thanks, Ingrid. Kate's got another question. The styles that you've described today are very top-down approaches. Are there any models based on bottom-up change models?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really good point. And that's one of the things that change management has evolved over, that initially they are quite top-down. But as we see, and certainly the change programs that I'm involved in, getting employees involved from the very beginning, having the middle managers involved in shaping and designing that change program is very helpful, because not everything can be top down. And in fact, some of the most successful change programs I've been involved in is where an outcome was described by the CEO, but it was actually the whole organisation in different ways that were able to come up with ways to be able to implement that change.
Thanks, Ingrid. Our next question from Robin. Are there any specific tips on how to identify these change agents when you start new in an organisation?
I think that it's by having conversations with other people who would be able to identify them for you. So developing that, when I talked about those connectors that people can connect you in. So often that they might be people that have been involved in change previously, so have a bit of an understanding of the methodology, but sometimes they might not even have been involved in change in a formal way. It's actually just their natural disposition to be able to engage in new ideas, being interested in innovation, and to explore the opportunity to connect with different people. And it also might be, for some people, a motivator is from a career that it's doing something outside of their day-to-day job, that is interested in progressing different skills and knowledge.
Thanks, Ingrid. Our next question: How do we deal with change where not only internal factors are going on, but also there are several external factors such as economical instability? How do we approach the change in a way that is not only to take it as a benefit to the organisation, but also a benefit for them? For me, those are key on my project manager job and difficult to dive in.
Absolutely agree that it's difficult to dive in. And the fact that when we talked before, I mentioned about the VUCA world that we live in, that it isn't a stagnant world. Like, it doesn't stop for us to be able to deliver change or projects. It is one of those things, again, that it's just thinking about when you're planning with your changes, what are the potential scenarios? So if this happened, what could we do? If that happened, what could we do? And it's having those options as part embedded into the planning. But because the reality is that we need to respond to the external environment through implementation of our programs, particularly if they're going over a 12 or more months.
Thanks, Ingrid. And I think we'll just jump on to our last question for today. In any of the models that we went through today, can you be in two steps or stages simultaneously?
I actually think you can. So if I reflect on some of the steps in the John Cotter's model, I mentioned before, after one of the questions, that at the beginning, it's obviously coming up with your vision and communications. But then you would absolutely, particularly, you could be in a sustaining at the end of the program, and you're thinking and going back and refreshing that. And I think that it isn't linear. As I mentioned, all of the models that we talked about today, it is possible to move back and forth depending on what's happening at that time.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. And thank you, everyone, for your questions today. That's all we have time for. You can join us on social media, where you can keep up to date with upcoming alumni events, webinars, and news. So do follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn. A big thank you today to Ingrid for such a wonderful presentation. To our audience today, you can submit feedback to us via email to deakinalumni@deakin.edu.au, and a recording of today's presentation will be available on our website in the next couple of weeks. I hope you can join us again next time, and have a great day. Thanks, everyone.